I was 4 years old when this story took place. We lived in a very mundane apartment complex that only had 3 floors, but that didn't bother me as I stayed home most of the time. One afternoon, I was home alone with my maid, who was cooking lunch for me. After lunch, she told me that she had to go work at someone's house that evening and that she didn't know when she'd be back. I remember feeling extremely sad, and that must have been evident on my face because she responded to my looks by saying, "You can come with me if you like, it's just a few doors down, so it's not much of a walk." My eyes lit up when she said this. The following evening, we arrived at the house. I could hear the television from where I was. My maid knocked on the door, but no one answered. When she knocked again, a young woman opened the door. She was sort of a partner for my maid who would work with her majority of the time. We stepped inside and immediately my eyes alighted to a very porky-looking woman with disheveled hair lying down on the couch holding a television remote. To my left, 2 young boys sat in front of each other busying themselves with toy blocks. My maid asked me to play with them, so I obliged. I sat down beside them as my maid and her friend strode out of the living room and into the kitchen. This is where the story starts to take a turn. 10 minutes after I sat down, I heard the woman suddenly gasp for air whilst clutching her chest. My heart sank and the blocks dropped from my hand. My maid and her friend rushed in and saw the woman's face turning blue. She kept croaking the words, "Big man, big man." Just then, a dark shadow materialized beside her. He was so tall that he stretched up to the ceiling. I was so scared I couldn't even think straight. The 2 boys next to me looked just as shocked as I was. Then, the woman fell silent and her eyes clamped shut. It was silent for almost a full minute before her eyes shot open again, and I swear, I thought her pupils had turned just a shade darker. I wish I wasn't there for what happened next. The woman began laughing like a maniac. Her wide eyes darted in their sockets from one end of the room to the next. She kept puffing up her chest and writhing around like a terrified worm. My maid stumbled back, hit the edge of the couch, and fell to the floor, throwing her hands behind to catch her balance. Meanwhile, her friend sprinted towards the balcony behind us, slid the sliding glass door open, and proceeded to throw herself out of it in fear. This triggered my instincts, so I jumped up and so did the 2 boys beside me. We tried our best to stop her from falling over. My maid rushed in and together we hurled her backwards. My maid then grabbed her friend by the shirt, pulled her close and said, "If we are going to get through this, we are going to together." We re-entered the living room, and by this point, the woman was on her knees with her arms above her head. She began waving them madly. My maid opened the door and left, leaving her petrified friend behind with us. The woman began taunting her eyes open wider than ever. Moments later, my maid arrived with 2 people, an older man and a younger woman. The woman took one look at the man, and her whole face fell as she threw him the blankest stare. Then, she began to growl as he approached her and shook her head violently as if to say no. The man took the remote and turned on the TV. He played around with the channels until he found one where a priest was reading a Bible verse. The woman fell to the floor and thrashed around wildly. The man bravely walked up to her and placed a hand over her forehead, then began threatening the spirit so that it would leave. After what felt like forever, the woman fell silent again. The man then turned to my maid and her friend, who were now shaking uncontrollably, and said, "I have to spend the night here. I can't leave this woman alone with her kids. You have to leave now." The 2 women didn't say anything, but merely shook their heads. My maid then did something which I felt to be extremely stupid. She volunteered to spend the night with him, and her friend reluctantly agreed, looking at her as if she had gone mad. This meant that I had to spend the night too, since I didn't like sleeping alone. The night whizzed by uneventfully, and the next morning when I awoke, the house felt quiet. Just then, my maid walked into the living room with that same friend of hers and stood a few inches away from the couch. They began silently arguing with each other over something I couldn't quite comprehend, but when the argument was over, my maid was the first one to step up. She tapped the woman on the shoulder and the woman opened her eyes again. Something about her eyes told me that she had returned to her normal self, but I wasn't all convinced of this theory. The woman sat up and looked at my maid in the eye. My maid then proceeded to ask her, "Ma'am, would you like some coffee?" The woman took a few seconds to respond, but when she did, it wasn't her voice that we all heard, but a deep, gruff voice, like that of a man. It echoed off the walls of the house as she said, "No." A few years later, when my maid recalled that incident to me, she then told me something that chilled me to the bone. She told me that a few months before that happened, her husband had assaulted and killed their 13-year-old daughter right before drowning himself in the bathtub. To this day, I will never understand why she didn't just move out of that house. I'm 15 years old now, and that experience still haunts me to this day.
I'll start off by saying that I'm not sure if I believe in the paranormal, but to be honest, I'm not sure how else to explain what I saw. A little background information. I lived in a part of London which during World War II was bombed by the Nazis. So some of the flats and houses were destroyed, and therefore were rebuilt later on. This experience took place when I was 7 to 9 years old. I'm not 100% sure how old I was exactly, but when we moved into the flat on the top floor of a 2-story building, I was excited that we were moving into a new place. It was much bigger than where we used to live. I picked out my room, and we spent the rest of the day decorating the place to make it ours. You know, the usual stuff. Nothing really happened for about a year, but in that time, my older half-brother moved in with us, and my little brother was born. It was around this time that things were starting to get weird. I started getting this feeling like I was being watched. I was never really a socially active child, and my parents were never really comfortable with me playing downstairs with the other kids, as they didn't know any of them, and they wouldn't have a clear view of me from the flat, so I would usually play by myself at home a lot. It started out when I was playing on my own. I would get this strange feeling in whichever room I was in, but upstairs is where I felt it the most. Sometimes I would see the outline of a person in the corner of my eye, but when I would turn to look, they would be gone. Sometimes I would look thinking that it was my parents or my older brother checking in on me, or maybe playing a trick, but again, no one was ever there. I would never hear anybody approaching either. At first I thought it was just my imagination. Maybe one of my brother's horror games had scared me more than I thought. After a few months of this, I was laying in my bed trying to get to sleep. I turned over and faced my door. That was when I caught a glimpse of a head, quickly ducking out of sight behind the doorframe. I was frozen in fear, but my heart began thumping in my ears, and I began breathing heavily. After a few seconds, I got up and ran to my parents' room, which was across the hallway. I had tears in my eyes and told them that I saw something staring into my room. My mom, in her groggy state, said that I just had a bad dream and I should go back to sleep. I told her I didn't want to because I was too scared. I kept glancing behind me to the doorway of my parents' room because from there you can see into my room, but of course I could see nothing. After my mom had woken up a bit, she could see that I was clearly panicked, and she decided to let me sleep in their room for the night. The next morning, I tried to forget all about the incident, and I was starting to believe that my mom was right, and it was just most likely a nightmare. But for the next few nights, I was too scared to face my door while I was in bed, and I wasn't sleeping well. I still had that overwhelming feeling of being watched, but it was worse now. It was almost like something was staring at the back of my head. After a couple of months of not seeing anything, I kind of forgot about it and started sleeping better as well. That all came to an end when I woke up in a cold sweat. I had had a nightmare or something, so of course I made my way to my parents' room. My mom was too tired to argue with me, and my dad had already left in the early hours of the morning for his job. So she agreed to let me sleep in the bed with her, as I laid there trying to go back to sleep. I pulled up the covers and glanced at the door, and there it was again. The same figure that I had seen before, except this time, it lingered. I was too scared to say anything. The best way I can describe it is that it was very tall. There was only about a foot of space from the top of its head to the doorframe. It had long fingers, and it was all black. It had no discerning features. However, once my eyes adjusted to the darkness, I could see a long, thin smile form where its face would have been. It was a truly disturbing sight to behold. I then blinked, and just like that, it was gone. This time I could feel myself having a panic attack. I didn't know what to do, so I pulled the covers over my head, moved over to my mom so my back was against hers, and tightly shut my eyes. I must have fallen asleep because the next thing I knew, my mom was waking me up for school. I told her what happened, and again she suggested that I just had a bad dream. I know that she was just trying to calm me down by trying to downplay it, but now I wasn't sure. For the next couple of weeks, I was too scared to sleep on my own. I refused to sleep in my room even with a nightlight or a lamp on. My parents gave in and said that I could sleep in their room for a while. I felt safer with my parents. However, at some point, I woke up one night and I needed to turn over. And as I did, I glanced at the doorway, and this time, I saw long skinny fingers curling around the doorframe, slowly followed by its head. That's when I realized it was peering around the door. Again, just like last time, I stared. I blinked, and its head was gone. I felt a small bit of relief as soon as I noticed the fingers were still there, and then, shortly after, the head came back, slowly peering from around the doorframe. Every time I would blink, the head would move away, but then would come back. Terrified, I again pulled the covers over my head and shut my eyes, breathing heavily, just trying to block it all out and go to sleep. This happened for another couple of weeks whenever I would stare at the door, so I tried my best to avoid doing so. Some time passed, and I managed to keep ignoring the doorway, and I was able to sleep better. I even thought that I would be able to go back into my room. I would just give it one more night in my parents' room, and then I would go back. That night, I again needed to turn over. I had fallen asleep on one of my arms, to the point where it lost blood pressure and had gone numb, so turning over in the bed took a bit more effort. I was about halfway over facing down into my pillow when I suddenly felt a hand, a large man-sized hand, big enough to cover the back of my head, push me down into the pillow and held me there. I couldn't breathe, I couldn't scream, and I couldn't push myself up. I felt like I was going to suffocate. In my head, I was screaming, begging for this hand to let me go, and after a few seconds, the hand let go and I could breathe again. I quickly turned to look, but of course, there was nothing there. I quickly woke up my mom and told her what happened. She could see how upset I was, so she held me until I calmed down. I don't remember seeing it again after that, and a year or so later, we moved to a flat that was downstairs, and I have never experienced anything like this again. It was only a couple of years ago, when I was talking about ghosts with my mother, that she remembered one night when we were living in the upstairs flat. She had fallen asleep on the sofa, which was against a wall. She had woken up and was about to head to the bedroom when she suddenly felt someone's arms grab her and wrap themselves around her chest, making it hard for her to breathe. She could hear the sound of paper crinkling under her feet, and she barely managed to choke out a whispered, "Get off!" And then whatever it was let go. When my mom looked, of course, there was nothing there, and there was no paper, so she had no idea what had made that noise. She never experienced anything like that since we moved. I realize now that this may have been why she was trying to convince me that whatever I was seeing was a bad dream or just my imagination. I think she believed me when I told her, and I had never felt more validated about what I experienced until right then. To this day, I still remember what that thing looked like, how it slowly moved into view, taunting me, because it knew how scared I was. I am an immigrant from Belarus. English is not my first language, so I apologize if I phrase things differently. Here's some backstory. I was only 11 when my family left the country after the collapse of the Soviet Union. My father was involved with the Communist Party and would frequently visit Moscow when I was a boy. I don't know all the details. I don't even know what exactly my father's role was in the USSR, but from what I understand, We were granted asylum in the United States and had to flee Belarus in 1991. But that's not really why I'm writing this story. This is about something I saw in my childhood that has scarred me for life. This took place roughly a year before we left, so I'm guessing the year was 1990. My family, like many others, lived in a massive apartment building in Minsk. There were 2 other identical apartment buildings adjacent to ours, and directly behind the buildings was a playground area where I would play with my friends Sasha and Victor. Beyond the playground was a section of trees that separated a shopping plaza from the apartment grounds. I remember that my mother was feeling ill and was bedridden, and my father was away on business in Moscow, so I was pretty much on my own that night. I remember that I had gotten bored watching TV in the living room and decided to go outside and see if any of my friends were at the playground. I would say this was around 8 p.m., and it was dark out. By then, most of the children were inside, and I don't even think anyone was allowed on the playground at that time, but I didn't care. There was no one around to tell me to go back inside, and I was pretty excited to have the playground all to myself. It was chilly out that night, but it was not snowing, so I figured that I would play on the slides and swing set until I either got bored or if security came along and told me to go back inside. So there I was, just swinging in the dark, when I heard something near the fence that separated the trees from the playground. It was a strange noise, like someone was sawing wood, but there was something just off about it. I ignored the sound, but it became louder as time passed, to the point where I became curious as to what was causing this strange noise. There were no lights at the playground itself, but there were lights mounted to the back of the apartment buildings that illuminated things just enough to where you could see your surroundings. But the trees beyond the fence were pitch black. I got off the swing set and approached the edge of the playground. The sound continued getting louder, even as I got up right to the fence. It wasn't until I let out a curious, "Hello?" that the noise ceased. I stood there staring into the dark trees, waiting for a response, but all remained silent. After about another minute passed, I innocently asked, "Why are you chopping down trees in the dark?" I then heard a shuffling from within the trees, and soon I saw a dark figure come into view, but did not step out from the tree line. What happened next is something that still makes me want to vomit out my insides. The dark figure then threw something. The object flew over the fence and hit me directly in the chest. I was knocked backwards, more out of surprise than the actual force of the impact. "Hey, why'd you do that?" I shouted, but before I could get another word out, I caught a glimpse of what had been thrown at me. A severed human arm was lying on the ground in front of me. I screamed at the top of my lungs and ran back towards the apartments, bawling my eyes out. I stormed into our apartment and sat on the living room couch to collect myself. I did think about waking my sick mother and telling her about what happened, but decided against it. To give you some perspective, my mother grew up in Siberia, and she could be quite ruthless at times. Not only would she not be too happy about being woken up, but she most likely wouldn't believe my story. And I probably wouldn't be able to sit down for a week if she found out I left the apartment alone after dark. So I kept this incident to myself. As a child, I understood that what happened was scary, but I had no grasp of the implications. I thought there was a monster in the woods who ate people who came out after dark. Now that I'm an adult, there are some things that I've come to realize. For our remaining time in Belarus, I never saw or heard any kind of investigation regarding a missing person or a mutilated body being discovered, which is nothing out of the ordinary living in Soviet society. The monster in the woods, hiding in the trees that night, was most likely a sadistic madman dismembering a human body with a hacksaw. There is one more thing that I should mention. For the rest of the time that we lived there, I cannot for the life of me recall ever seeing my friend Sasha again after that night.